Now it is my pleasure to introduce Syd Carpenter. Syd Carpenter received her BFA and MFA from the Tyler School of Art. Her work is in the collection of many vaulted institutions. Just to name a few here for us today: the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Tang Museum at Skidmore College, the Pederucci Family Collection of African American Art, the Fuller Craft Museum in Boston, the Philadelphia Museum of Art here in Philadelphia, the Renwick Gallery of American Art of the Smithsonian Museum, our very own James A. Michener Art Museum, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the Frederick S. Weissman Collection in Los Angeles, and the Philadelphia African American Museum, just to name a few of an extensive list. Syd has shown widely, including the Philadelphia African American Museum, the Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston, the Dallas Museum of African American Art, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Walton Art Center in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Just again, to name a few. Recently, Syd was awarded a Distinguished Educators Award for 2020 from the James Redwick Alliance of the Smithsonian. When she's not making art all the time, she is a tenured professor at Swarthmore College. And I just want to read this little statement that Syd has made about her work. Working as an artist has been the source of all that has been meaningful and a source of joy in my life. Art is my common ground around which revolves my interaction with family, teaching, and community. The enthusiasm and commitment I bring to my teaching is an outcome of the level to which I engage in my art, while community involvement allows me to share the value I place on the visual with those who may otherwise disregard its impact upon their lives. Family is a constant source of inspiration, both as image and encouragement. I don't believe artists make the decision to become artists, they are born. The hope is that they find the will to pursue their vision in an environment which develop in a cultural respectful of their contributions. Wow. If that doesn't get you inspired to look and think about art, I don't know what will. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Syd Carpenter. Syd, I'm going to conjure you from the internet here. Where are you? There you are. Hi, Syd.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you, Matt, for that really nice introduction. And I also want to thank the Michener for giving me the space, the honor of displaying my work in such a beautiful, beautiful environment. So if you haven't seen the show and you're able to get there, it's a live show, it's up, and I'm so pleased with it, and just want to thank all the staff that have worked with me on this project, and it's just, you know, it feels really good. And so I'm really happy to be able to spend this kind of rainy afternoon with you guys. I'm glad that you were able to make it to this talk. And what I have thought about for you is I thought it would be a good idea to just give you a kind of sense of how the objects that you would see in the museum at the Michener, how they got there, what's the point behind them. And so in order to do that, I have to think about, you know, not only, you know, making the art, but where it comes from. And it comes from history, and it's my own history, and also just things that I notice. It's an important part of just, as an artist, what are the things that are crucial to me? What stimulates me? What makes me get up in the morning? What makes me want to go into the studio and make something? So what I'm going to do is bring this up. So there you go. Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah, we're good. All right, so what's really, really important to know about me, in addition to being an artist and an educator and someone who's very heavily involved with my family, is that I also garden. And this has really been critical to everything that I have been doing now, currently, in my work. Ooh, let's see, it's speeding up on me. Let me go back. Let's see if I can, having some technical, yeah. Okay, here we go. So what's important is that I am a gardener. And so it informs just about everything that I do in my sculpture. So these are just a few views of the garden that I've done over the years. And the reason why I garden is because it's another studio for me. It's another place to just engage color, to engage texture, to engage shapes. So it's just a place where I get to explore all those different things just in this medium that we refer to as plants. So this is another view of that same garden. And one of the things that's also important to me about the garden is also how it allows me to interact with my community, what it allows me to do, who comes to this space to look at what I'm doing. Just because a lot of people, of course, are interested in the plants. And when I start to think about them and talk to them about it as art, that becomes this connection that I'm able to establish. Now, the other key thing is, where did this come from? Because when I was beginning this garden, I was thinking about where and who looks like me, who has a history like mine. Who are those folks? Where did that come from? And I didn't have to look very far, because I could go back to my own family history and to this woman in particular, who's my granny. I always call her Granny, and her name was Indiana Hudson. And Indiana Hudson had a garden in Pittsburgh, and she had a victory garden in the 1940s during World War II and beyond. And the upper right shows you the location of her garden. And that location now, I went to find her garden a few years ago. I wanted to see where my granny had made her garden. And it was at this corner, which is to this day still a park. It's still a garden. So I love that. And the lower right-hand image is of what she would have seen when she was gardening, looking down over the Monongahela River. Her husband was a steel worker, so he would have been working in one of the mills along the river. But she gardened, and this was the view from her garden. The other person that was really important to me would have been my mother, and this is Ernestine. She was an amazing gardener. I'm looking at these images, this image of the 2 trees that she planted in the front of my house many, many years ago when I was a teenager. And I remember her sticking in these 2 little sticks that looked just, I mean, I couldn't believe that anything would grow from these things, but here they are, these 25-foot, even larger trees that my mother planted. So this gardening in particular has always informed my work. So I came to the Tyler School of Art to paint and draw, but also I was drawn into the ceramics area. And in working with clay, that was also just one of the things that I became completely enamored of, obsessed with, became passionate about it. But the work that I developed always referred to the garden. So you have these kinds of pots that refer to the colors that you would see in a garden, that would look like the textures that you would see in a garden. So these kinds of influences have always just been a part of what I do. So here's a series of pots that I did very, very early out of grad school. And these were kind of the works that kind of launched me into this whole notion that I could make things and someone would want to exhibit them and show them and maybe even own them. And it was just this kind of affirming series of pieces that I did at the beginning of becoming, being out in the world as an artist. And generally in terms of size, they were about anywhere from 15 inches, 20 inches. So there was a kind of girth to them. And that's also something that's really important to me, is the just the fleshiness of the process and of the making, and trying to imbue the object with a certain kind of animation and just a kind of visceral quality, if you will. So these were about that kind of growth and deterioration at the same time. And it continued. These are some larger pieces. The one on the left is called Corkscrew Liana. Lianas are these vine-like plants that you'll see in the forest wrapping around trees, and they're very, very aggressive. And you see them just as they twine their way up. There's a certain kind of energy that I'm really, really attracted to. And so this piece is about a little over 6 feet in length, and it hangs on the wall. And the other one on the other side is called Germinating Seed. And it's a reflection of the things that I'm observing in nature and around me, and trying to find visual signals, visual elements that will convey that look. So, and also what's key to this series, what begins to happen is my connection to movement. When you're thinking about clay, you're often thinking about it as this heavy weighted substance. And it's important as you're building to try to defy gravity, because this object, you know, the clay itself is heavy, and you've got something that's weighted down. And you want to elevate it. You know, when you're working on the wheel, the whole idea is to bring that thing up. We're always talking about going up, spreading it out, and you defy gravity. And so I wanted to bring that trait, that component of the visceral quality of the living quality of an object into these larger pieces, and give a sense that their configuration could change and move, that there's elasticity, that there's flexibility, that they have the potential to reconfigure themselves. If you were to turn away from them and then turn back, they would have changed their shape. So in these, I'm looking for that kind of springy, stretchy quality. This is a piece that uses those same ideas. This is at the Pennsylvania Convention Center, and it's called Inner Workings. And I was, once again, you see the influence of the plants and the water and the flowers, and but I was also thinking about what was behind that wall. That's why it's called Inner Workings. And I imagine that there's all kind of wires and boxes and containers and all kinds of things to help that building, the convention center, function. So this thing was about, oh, good grief, I'm thinking about maybe 15 feet to 20 feet in length. This is another version of that. This is, you know, the idea of the change, the possibility of change, but also referencing a toy, a child's toy, because that ring at the end gives you the suggestion that you could pull on it and stretch that thing out. But at the same time, at the other end, there is this knot, there is this kind of organic form that is springing out of that energy that's coming from the actual coil. So this thing is a little bit more than 4 feet in length. And the title of it is Blood Ties. This piece is called A Snake Without a Head is Just a Rope. Once again, oversized, a little over 5 feet in length, hanging on the wall. And the title of it, A Snake Without a Head is Just a Rope, comes from African sayings that are actual taunts. So if you have a competing group, you can say that they are a snake without a head and they're just a rope. So that's a kind of insult. And so I use this kind of very, very twisted, complicated configuration at the top. And as it evolves and moves down, it starts to unravel into a kind of hemp or rope-like surface and form. More plant-like forms, apothecary on the left, and the other one is actually looking like a branch, literally. But at the top, you can see that there's a wheel. And that wheel suggests that there's some kind of man-made intervention here. And this piece is called Control of Nature, which shows you that there's this sense, there's this, I guess, the audacity of thinking that you can control nature. So we have a wheel at the top that opens and closes the bud. So a closed bud on one side, an open bud on the other. More toy-like forms, same kind of scale that we're looking at. And I did a series of rattles, and this is one of the rattles. And because I'm a gardener, I made this piece that's called 4 Seasons of Interest. And for those of you who are gardeners, you know that in your plantings, you're thinking about what's going to happen in all 4 seasons. Is there going to be something of interest in the winter, spring, summer, and fall? So this piece, and you can get a sense of the scale of this. It starts off with, at the end where you can see these black forms, they're actually blood cells, but I use them to suggest a plant form, petals of a flower. And as you move along the coil, you come to my head, which is a planter. that can be seeded and things can grow out of it. So that's a self-portrait that moves along. And then it moves into another season where there's a brain that may have seeded what's going to go in my head as a pot. And then another extension that comes out as the stem. So this is the 4 seasons of interest self-portrait. One of the things that you notice in a garden is obviously are the leaves themselves, spectacular. I mean, I depend more on leaves in my garden than I do on flowers because they're going to always be there. Flowers tend to disappear after about 2 weeks generally. So I was looking at leaves and decided, well, what would happen if this very flat, one-dimensional, transparent thing suddenly became much larger, to the tune of about 27 inches, and was inflated. What would it look like? What would a 27-inch inflated leaf look like made out of clay? And so I did this series of these inflated leaves, and the result was that they looked like animals. They took on this kind of bestial quality, but at the same time, they were derived from things that I observed from looking at leaves. And so I was able to manipulate the clay and give them this kind of fleshiness and fullness. And once again, the idea of movement. And when you look at the bottom of these pieces, you can see that the, excuse me, they never actually settle down. They're always potentially moving. Excuse me again. So that was a motivating gesture in all of this series of leaves, was to have them have this tentative bestial-like feeling, but still coming away or at least taking their cues from just delicate, flat, small things. So just the reversal of their traits. This is another one called Old Soul, and this is about 3 feet in length. So they're larger, and that sense of them being some kind of animal, unidentified animal. This is Merge. And Be Careful of Me. So, you know, in this piece, thinking that I want this thing to feel like it could lift off, it could move. There's a certain kind of aggression in its stance. Let's see, go back here. As these pieces developed and I was still gardening, I started doing some research about African-American gardens and yards and came across this book by Richard Westmacott, who's a horticulturalist at the University of South Carolina, retired now. But he did this very, very anthropological study of African-American farms and gardens. He looked at about 42 African-American farms and gardens in 3 states in the South. And he created maps, very, very detailed graphic maps of each of these locations. And he was able to find, or what he did is he developed these different kind of markings to talk about what was a plowed field, what was grass, what was a house, what was a tree. And in looking at these maps, I just got the idea that, well, once again, what happens if I blow them up? What happens if they turn into very, very fleshy, large sculptural things? So I started making this series, and what you see is the piece on the left, which is in response to this particular Westmacott map. So I was able to just look at the textures, look at the shapes, and make this translation into sculpture without trying to make a model. These are not models. And so what happens is you get this other language, you get this other, you know, the symbols become more about how things fit together. Because once again, I'm making sculpture. I know that there are certain things that I need to fulfill my investigation of form and surface. And so I'm interested in light, what happens. So this is something that wouldn't have happened in the maps. He was just making symbolic marks to give himself some kind of information specific to this place, something that could be carried across to any number of other farms that he was doing. So this is the series. And what was important about each series, of course, was that even though I was not making models of the place, I knew that I was representing places that had to do with people's lives. So in making my response to the maps, it became very important for me to name them. And I named them, or at least identified them as portraits of the places, hence the name, Places of Our Own, and also to name whose land it was. What's key about all of these pieces that I made is that these folks have been on their land for multiple generations. And when you think about African Americans on the land in the South, you can pretty much, you don't have to imagine it. You're aware that that must have been a hard row to hoe. You know, you were in a hostile territory, basically, and you were always in a situation where you were getting denied the same kinds of things that maybe the other farmers, the other white farmers were getting. And this was kind of government practice. You didn't get the loans, you didn't get the seed, you didn't get the things in time to plant. So you really had to be pretty courageous. You had to be pretty ingenious, if you will, to keep your land over multiple generations. Because at the same time, and this is from about, during Jim Crow, when people were leaving, the Great Migration was underway, and people were leaving the land because of just how intolerable the situation was. So whenever I would come across a farm that had been in a family for multiple generations, I realized that these were some tough folks, that they had managed somehow to secure their land and continue to own it into the contemporary times. So this is, so for that reason, I name them. So I'm going to just run through some of the images of these pieces and name their names. It's kind of a roll call. So this is Buddy and Rosina Burgess. And detail of Buddy and Rosina. So you can see the kind of things that I'm interested in the detail and the things that I observe in pattern, surface, light. And the color of the clay, the color of the surface for me is making skin, black skin, beautiful satiny African-American skin. And so it's not, it's so they're there, they're embodied there, but without actually showing their faces, but their bodies are there. This is Willie and Jelena Gray. Percy Robinson. And in terms of scale, they're probably about 2 feet by, I don't know, 2 feet by 30 inches. They're fairly large. And for the most part, they went on the wall, but I realized that they are landscapes. So I've also often shown them, or I've shown them in a horizontal configuration because they are on the land. So there's a landscape quality to them, not only as pictorially as if it was an image or a painting on the wall, but also they can live on a horizontal surface. This is James and Flora Page. A detail of James and Flora. Mary Lou Furcron. Inez Faust. Lucille and Leland Hollyfield. So having used Richard Westmacott's book to produce that series, I realized it was time for me to hit the road and go visit the farms myself. And so I got connected to an organization called the Southern African American Farmers Organic Network. And they were able to provide me with a list of organic farms owned by African Americans in Georgia and South Carolina and the Gullah Islands. And what I was looking for were things, details, you know, arriving at these farms, because I know Westmacott had noted what he saw, and he was able to come up with this graphic, these graphic notations of what was there, what a building looked like for his maps. But I was just looking for texture. I was looking for idiosyncratic things that distinguished each of them. So this is something that I saw on one of the farms. I think it was at Troy Johnson's farm. Also, when I was in Atlanta, I visited the Living Well Farms, which is Rashid Nori's farm. And he had created an urban farm that was on the site of a demolished high-rise apartment building. But instead of clearing it completely, they had left stairways, paths. There was no building, but here was this place that spoke of a past life for this area, but he had created a garden. And it was about 2 acres that this garden was occupied. But I was really interested in all of these kind of details. So these are things I photographed and took note of. And I went back to the studio and started building. So this is some of the stuff that was in progress that would eventually become finished products, finished sculptures. So here we begin with Troy Johnson. Troy Johnson was in Monticello, Georgia. And what I noticed on Troy Johnson's farm, in addition to his sheds, was also that he liked to, well, he was very inventive when it came to watering. So I included in the base of these his just ingenious use of hoses. There were hoses all over the place. And so there's the farm in clay on top, and the bases are made of steel, fabricated steel. And so rather than the bases just being supports, they reinforce the narrative, what's going on. So the entire sculpture includes the steel as well as the clay, not just clay on top of a pedestal. So this is a detail showing one of Troy's fences. The bird that you're seeing, that was a bird that was, it was just a fabricated bird. It was something that was just a toy that was in one of his enclosed areas. And it was just this distinct thing. I mean, Westmacott would never have included that in his anthropological maps that he did. But this was something that I saw that was pretty distinct and idiosyncratic about Troy Johnson's farm and garden. And there's Troy, holding forth. Mary Howard. Mary Howard, this is her piece that's also in the show. Mary Howard had an amazing collection of stuff on her property, including these antique kitchen utensils. She canned things, and she also had this wonderful glider that I loved, and I needed to include that and use that as the base for, or at least included it in the entire sculpture, just as a distinctive artifact that showed up, and I could see it as an important part of just the sculptural information that I could provide. And so one of the things that you need to understand about these pieces as well is that the configuration is one of a plant. So the base, the lower part, and in this case, it would be the glider, is the roots. And then as you ascend and go up and look up, there's a stem area. And then as you get to the top, the clay becomes the flower. This is Sarah Reynolds. She was on the Gullah Islands. She had an organic farm and a restaurant. And she also shared a lot of what she did with the surrounding community. She held classes to teach children how to, and just the community in general could come to her farm and learn how to garden organically. And this is Sarah Reynolds' sculpture. That bench is something that I saw in one of her fields, had to use it. The fruiting is on the stem, and then just more information about what I saw, the cart that she moved her vegetables around, the baskets that filled up the produce, all of those things. Those are just details that I had to include. And each one of these farms, of course, I could reproduce a number of different versions of it because my observation of them was, I had so many photographs of things that I could do, but there could be several chapters for each one of these farms. This is Pearl Fryer. Pearl is kind of a movie star, and literally a movie star. There's a movie about him called A Man Named Pearl. And Pearl is famous for topiary gardening. And so this is the piece that I did in response to his garden. He creates topiary using a hedge clipper. And so the thing that looks like a fence at the bottom is actually the clippers themselves. And so that becomes the root. There's the stem, and the clay part is, you see numbers and you see shapes. And those shapes are things that I actually saw that he had cut into topiary in his garden. Helen and Joseph Fields, once again, they are organic farmers on the Gullah Islands. And they had a museum of antique kitchen utensils on their property as well. And they were very hardcore about attaining the status of being organic farmers in their area. And so the bottom is one of the sheds that I saw, and of course, things that I saw in their museum. And then the flower on top shows a plate of food, clothespins, there's a lot of detail that happens as you move around the sculpture. So that's an important part of me as a sculptor, is that when you're working three-dimensionally, I would like you as the viewer to be compelled to move. The object is sitting there, and if you get it from just one view, then I think I've not done my job. So it's important for you to move around and see what's going on with each piece. This is Professor O'Neill Smalls, and he is the proprietor and the CEO of a farm called Freewood's Farm. And Freewood's Farm is a place that was the first cooperative African-American farm after emancipation. And he still lived, and he grew up on the farm. So it lasted for over 100 years as a co-op. And he has since turned it into a museum. So you can go there and visit this farm and see the buildings and see the way that the place is being farmed to this day. This is the actual sculpture that I produced from being on his farm, showing the building. And of course, you might be curious about, why is there a gun there? Well, it's because when that farm was established, it was basically in, once again, hostile territory. And so it not only was to shoot varmints, if you will, but also as a protective device. They needed to have a gun because they were not welcomed where they were. And so this is just something that I noticed in one of the rooms of one of the buildings, was that there was a gun over the door. So in seeing this, it gave me this sense of, yes, they were emancipated, but no, they were not safe. And the form at the bottom, I saw several of these slatted, pointed roofed structures laying on the ground. And it was just a place to store vegetables before they were actually brought in. So you could, if they were harvesting potatoes, they could stick them in there and keep them dry until they were able to come back and get them. So that, just as a sculptural form, these wooden slatted forms were, I just thought, quite beautiful. But this is in steel, and the steel has been manipulated to look like wood. And Albert and Albert Howard are twins. And Albert and Albert Howard have a farm in Monticello, Georgia. They're neighbors of Troy Johnson. And they do cattle ranching as well as growing produce. And they also have a construction business. So they're quite enterprising guys. But one of them they're both called Albert. One is with an A and the other one is with an E. and they are inseparable. And this is the piece I did in response to Albert and Albert. So I have them on this kind of the two wheels, which represents both men and how they are rolling down a rutted road. And that is their concern on top. One of their sheds, on another view, you would see that there's a cow. So this is just a representation of them as a portrait, because these are still portraits to me. So here I am now at the Michener Museum and the exhibition, and I thought you might be interested in seeing just the process of installing such a show. And this is Catherine, who is looking at the work when it is just delivered, so you can see the beginnings of how the show came to be what it is and how it looks. You know, the work unloaded. Crates in the space. Very, very careful positioning of each piece by Rick and Chen. And ultimately the installation, carefully positioned, well lit. This piece is called Ramshackle Fence. And it recalls just things that I saw there, just the kind of ad hoc way that things are put together, because the folks are really, really resourceful. And in it, you start to see the clothespin. You see a clothespin on the lower left, and there's a clothespin somewhere in the middle. And that becomes important because I also wanted to show you what I'm working on these days. And it comes back to my mom again, Ernestine, who was a gardener, but also just I've started a series of work where I really pay homage to her and create works that reflect my sense of who she was to me when I was a child, and still as her daughter. So I use the clothespin to represent her. And I've done this series of clothespin pieces. They're about 2 feet in height. And I include her in the form of a clothespin because I still have the bag of clothespins that she used to hang my clothes when I was a little kid, my brother and my sister, and her own. And so I have her in a plate of beans because she was a provider, but in doing so, she was so elegant and just a beautiful, beautiful woman. So I've just done this series of clothespins in her name. And this is Mother Pin. The series is called Mother Pins. And this is Mother Pins with red beans. Mother Pins with a basket. Mother Pin, arise. This is Mother Pin, a fire. Mother Pin, awash. And that's the end, back to the garden. Everything starts there. So thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Sid. That was fantastic. Yes, we have some virtual
Oh, thank you. Hi,
and
Mary.
real life applauses here. So we have some questions. I want to get to them. First here, Actually, Meredith, would you like to you and ask your questions? Do you feel comfortable doing that?
Sure. Hi. Thank you, Ms. Carpenter. This is wonderful.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I am joining you from Seattle, and so big Jacob Lawrence country.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about the Great Migration series that I've seen, and as I was looking at your sculpture, I was wondering about other folks like that who have depicted similar themes. I wondered how much your photography and then your sculpture and your observations are informed by some of the painters who tackled similar subjects.
Well, it's interesting because when I was doing my research, I was looking for artists who were working on this subject, and who was actually describing African American farmers. Jacob Lawrence had done the migration series, and Romare Bearden had done a few things, and Benny Andrews had done some things, but very, very few. And I understood why, because artists at the time were trying to distance themselves from the experience. They did not want to be associated with that thing that they had fought so hard to get away from. Getting off the land, not being associated with farmers. That was backwards. That was down home. So there were just not a whole lot to see. And when I would see it, it would be these kind of romanticized images. I can't remember all of the things that I saw, but these kind of romanticized images of people in the fields singing spirituals and being happy. And I just thought, I don't think so. And so, so there wasn't a whole lot. So in making this, I actually thought I could be filling a void here. And, that I'm sure that there are so many other artists who can, amplify this just exponentially. But I was hoping this, just making these objects visible and getting them out there, more of a conversation could be held about it, because right now there is just a diminished number of African Americans on the land. I mean, it's hard to be on the land, no matter who you are, but to survive and to continue and to keep it in the family, those are the things that I admired about all of these people that I encountered.
I was interested in the Atlanta urban gardening efforts. Here in Seattle, we have the pea patch system where people can get on a long waiting list and eventually get your own little patch of land in the city to farm. And we have a really strong farmers market system. But they also, the waves of immigrants and the blood in the soil has been shown through things like the Japanese were the biggest strawberry farmers in this region for a long time on places like Bainbridge Island. And then when the executive order came and all these Japanese were forced off their land, what was left behind and who recorded those stories? And we were fortunate that there were some talented photographers at the time who caught that moment. And there are now, memorial museums and places where you can learn about those stories that they don't really teach in our public schools. So I find it really interesting when this push and pull between urban and suburban and farmland, and how can we reconnect? And so I'd love to hear more about the Atlanta farm you encountered on that urban space that had once been housing. And I like the way that they kept some of the paving stones and steps. And what was it like to encounter the folks there and hear their stories when you're in the city of Atlanta?
Well, that is part of a series of gardens called the Living Well Farms that was started by a man named Rashid Nouri. And Rashid Nouri is this Harvard-trained economist, horticulturalist. He was in the Clinton administration. He's written books, and he decided that he was going to address the food desert issues in the Atlanta area. And he has established a number of farms and gardens in the Atlanta area. So he's someone that you really do, if you're interested in this issue, you have to put him at the top of your list for information, because he's also published around it and it's quite successful. The piece that I did of his is about a block away from Martin Luther King's Ebenezer Church. And so I include that in the sculpture that I did of his. So yeah, that whole system that he's done down in Atlanta is many years old and well established. You know, as is in Detroit, there's a whole other system of farms and gardens as well. I mean, Detroit, as it turns out, has more urban gardens than any city in the United States. I mean, it is farming craziness out in the actual city of Detroit. They have more gardens than any other city. Mm-hmm. Oh, unmute yourself.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I told you we'd have at least one disconnection, so I jumped off for a second. Getting into some of the other questions here. There was a question about some of the symbols that you use. I think wanting to know more about, maybe go in a little about the eggs and some of the other reoccurring symbols that are found in the work. Well, can you talk about what those mean, how you arrive at them, and how do you decide to keep including them in different types of works?
Well, you know, they are what I notice. There's this wonderful saying that I borrowed from Chris Staley in his teaching, and he says, notice what you notice if you're looking for what your art is going to be and what it is. I mean, what are the things that you observe that make you pause, not what you think someone would want to see? So in visiting the gardens, you know, there were eggs, there were the interior buckets from old washing machines. There were, of course, benches and stools and things like that. And why do I continue to use them? Because they were sometimes ubiquitous. There were always chickens and eggs on all these farms. There was always some kind of seating somewhere out in the garden, because you knew they went out there, and when they got tired from weeding, they sat. And so those are the things that, you know, because these are portraits and you're trying to describe a place and the person without actually putting their physical representation there, you're looking for those distinctive little nuggets of identity of that place. So that's why I use them again. And also it's a signal, it's a way in. Because if you can recognize an egg or you can recognize a wheel, you're going to start to explore and make connections with the things that maybe you're not so familiar with. And you get, and I find that when folks do that, they get very, very close to what the objects are. I know they may not see them as farms right away. And then they start seeing that there's a kind of organic quality, that the surfaces remind them of skin, that the buckets remind them of something that they've seen in their own garden, things like that. So I think I would refer to them as signals.
That's great. Thanks, Sid. Jim, I know you had some questions, and I see you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to ask them, or do you want me to?
Well, first I'd like to say that Sydney, she's not our first Sydney at the Michener. The chairman of our board is Sydney as well. Yeah. But he's not nearly as creative as Syd Carpenter is. So I'm glad to see Syd Carpenter here rather than Sid Martin. Also, I'm originally from Indiana, and I used to live in Pittsburgh as well. I only wish I had known Sydney's grandmother in Indiana when I was in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. 3 questions. Number one, I mentioned about the movie about Pearl, and somebody said they'd already seen it. It was very good. So Matt, if you could find a link, if it's available on Netflix or otherwise, So the rest of us could be able to see it, would enjoy doing that.
It's a wonderful movie.
It's fantastic.
Good. Second item was, I'd sure be interested in knowing, Swarthmore is not necessarily very far from here. Does she have a gallerist that's nearby or elsewhere where we might be able ourselves to acquire some of her art? And then the third question observation was, building on the shoulders of what she has created already, what are her future plans or future projects, and where does she wish to go with her art now?
Okay. Well, in reference to where I show, there is a woman who has been working with me. She doesn't have a gallery per se, but she is able to get images out to potential collectors. And of course, there's always my studio right here in Philadelphia. You are welcome to come. So that's if anyone was ever interested in just seeing more work and seeing where it's made, you are welcome to visit. I am in Philadelphia. Easy to get to. So if anybody is interested in a studio visit sometime in the future when we return to, I don't know, the possibility of interacting in that way. But, we can do social distancing if somebody wants to come and see the studio. Also, in terms of what I'm planning, continuing to make the work. I have a show that's going to be at Rowan University coming up, so I'm working on that. I've also been working with the Woodmere Art Museum on an outdoor project where I've designed a hugel. I don't know if any of you know what a hugel is. A hugel is a type of gardening formation where you do this shaped sculptural raised bed and you plant on it. So they're planning a hugel, which I designed. And so I'm liking the idea of combining the sculpture even more literally with the gardening. So getting out there and doing some more outdoor projects that are ephemeral because eventually they will melt down. But I like the idea of doing that. And I'll continue doing the mother pins and as farms come up. So it's just kind of an ongoing nice mixture of different ways to apply my, just this compulsion to make stuff. Can't hear you, Matt.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you, Sid. And Jim, the movie is on Amazon if you want to rent it or watch it there. I put the link in the chat there for you. Thank you for those questions. Next, there was a question about scale for these, especially the ones in the show. And I will say that the scale for all of these is very tricky. Like you see it in a picture and then you see it in person and they have the ability to shape shift. I feel like, sometimes you think they're going to be huge and they're small. Sometimes you think they're going to be small and they're huge. How do you think about scale when you go out designing these art pieces?
Well, for the longest time, even in the earlier pieces where I started doing the wall pieces that were about 4 or 5 feet in length, I tend to engage objects on a scale that's closest to my own proportions. So when you walk up to a sculpture, there's this sense of parity, if you will, that this thing has the same kind of physicality as you do. It has the same kind of mass. It has the same kind of musculature. So you kind of physically identify with it, even if you don't see a body. That thing in front of you has the same kind of capacity as a body. It has, the forms are the size of your thigh or your arm or your head or something like that. So that's been something that has just been consistent. For practical reasons, I once promised myself this year I'm going to do small things because I want to have space in my studio. Didn't happen. Didn't happen. Nope, that stuff, it feels like bodies. It feels like a body, the stuff that I'm making. Even the mother pins. Now, though, that would be my version of small. So they're about 18 to 20 inches. That's as small as it ever got. Oh, a long time ago, I think I did something that was 6 inches. And you'll never see it because it's in China now. Yeah, I'm actually in a collection in Zhengzhou, China.
All right.
And it's a tiny little thing because that's the only thing I could get on the plane.
That's good to know. Well, maybe someday we'll all have to go there and check it out.
The tiny Sid piece.
Yeah, the tiniest one in the world. It's so far
Right,
away.
the tiniest one in the world in a collection is in Zhengzhou, China.
I actually had a question that is something from one of the past talks you gave. You were talking about your process of making these portraits, and it struck me as a very sort of like translative process. You've talked a little bit about that. And you said this thing at one of these last talks that has, like, I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks. And you said you want to, when you're talking about the source material, right, whether it's a person or a farm or an image, you said you want to borrow its audacity, which I thought was amazing. And thinking about like somehow borrowing that random or energy that can't be pinned down. And so the question I've been chewing over is like, how do you purposely make something that is intentionally like wild, like it's intentionally it can't be located, it can't be situated. You're trying to do this thing where it's departing purposefully or unexpectedly from its source. Like, how do you plan for the unplannable? Like, how does that process work out in your mind? And, when you make these portraits from the maps and you're doing that translation process, what is that? How do you do that? Do you just like lose control at some point? Do you have a method for moving and being flow through unthinkable options? How does that work for you?
Well, first off, the approach that I take is, I know I'm going to make something and that it is going to be around this theme. And in the early pieces, I had this map. And I have to realize that at a certain point, I have to unhook myself from my source. I have to have it leave the room because I have already engaged. I know I'm going after this. I've seen the source material, but now as a sculptor, I have to now begin the risk taking. And I don't know what any of them are going to look like. That's important. I don't have a sense of how I want it to look when it's finished. Some things, when I was doing the steel pieces, I would draw out the steel bases because I need to give it to the fabricator. So he needed to have something. But as far as the clay elements, it was my willingness to make something really ugly. And that's important because if you are somehow bound by the need to have it look good, then you are going to restrain yourself constantly. You're going to hold back, pull back. Now, in terms of issues of craftsmanship, I'm a stickler. I want it to work. I want it to be built well. But in terms of making combinations, I never know. I don't know what looks good next to what. I don't have that. I know that there's probably some innate sense of design, but I'm off the rails when I'm making because I don't know what the hell I'm making. That's why I don't have assistants in my studio. I don't have an assistant. I don't have someone in there doing all of the little things that require a lot of detail. I have to do it myself because I don't know how it's going to happen. It's one of those things where I'm very inconsistent because I am trying to allow that atmosphere of risk taking and the willingness to make something ugly, because if I'm not willing to take that risk, I'm not going to discover anything. And it's, so there's an audacity to it. It's just, okay, what if I do that? What if I try this? And of course, things fail. And so I get to edit. And also one of the things that I do in my studio is I'll make something and it's really bad and I'll fire it. But there might be a good part. There might be some part that actually worked. So even though it's fired, I take my Sawzall and I cut off the good part and I preserve that. And then I can add it on to another sculpture someplace. And so I've been doing that because, it takes just as long to make a bad one as it does to make a good one. So you're always walking this tightrope of, Jesus, I just made a 6 foot long failure. That thing is not good, but what am I going to do with it? Okay, I fired it. I worked on it. I sanded it and I fell in love with it. And then I stand back and I think, shouldn't have done that. And so there it is. You just have to take risks and be willing to fail.
Wow, I love this image of you taking a Sawzall to a 6 foot ceramic piece you just made.
What do you do with them? They take up space. You have to cut those bad boys up.
I love it. And I think that's a really fitting image for us to end this great conversation with. I want to thank all of you in the audience here today for joining us. I also want to thank the partners for Sid's show, Portrait of Our Places. It's generously supported by Dr. Lamberto Bentivoglio and Barbara Donnelly Bentivoglio, the Silver Family Partnerships, and Pico. And
Can
lastly,
everybody turn their cameras on so I can see who was here?
yeah, let's
I
see
like
here.
you guys. I only see names.
There you go.
Hey. Hey. Hi.
There you go.
Where's Neil? Neil. Hi. Hey. There you are. I love this. It's like a big reveal.
Yeah, it's like the Brady Bunch here. I love it.
It is. It's terrific. Where's Barbara? No, Barbara must have gone. Oh, there's. Okay. Hi, Meredith. Is Kathleen's iPad? I guess we can't see Kathleen. How about George and Ann? Is George there? George and Ann? No? Okay. Anyway, nice to see most of you anyway. Thank you for coming. Hey, there's someone right there.
There you go.
Hi, Barbara.
Hey.
Thanks for coming.
Great. Thank you, Sid, once again. And thank you everyone again for coming. Again, if you want to hear more from Sid tonight, 7 p.m., we'll be doing this. Something very similar again tonight. So tell your friends, tell anyone who missed this today, we'll be there. And again, please, I encourage you all to come and see the show if you are able. It'll be up through the end of February, so you have a little bit of time. Until then, until we can see each other in person, I want to wish everyone to stay safe, stay healthy, and stay arty. We'll see you later, everyone. Bye.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Matt. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.